Well, welcome to Agathos Ministries, the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. Last time we talked about the flood. Okay, well, the flood issue is a big water issue. Well, now we've got something else going on here. We have a boat issue. So we're going to talk today, Genesis 6 through 9, Noah's Ark. So water last time, boat this time. What is the deal? What is going on? Genesis 6:14 through 6:16. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Room shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it of. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. And the door of the ark thou shalt set in the side thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. They got it. Ready to go grab our hammer and our saws and go build an ark now, right? So we got a lot of information that is implied here, and a lot of information is missing. For starters, a cubit. A cubit is the measure of a man from the elbow to the tip of the fingers. Traditionally, it ranged from 15 inches to 18 inches. Now, this is the way they did cubits during most of the Egyptian pharaoh periods, is whoever was the ruler at the time was the official cubit measure. And so they would go up to the pharaoh and say, "Hey, Pharaoh, let's see the arm, sir." He'd stick out his arm. They'd measure it from the bend in his elbow to the tip of his finger, and that's how long a cubit was, so long as that pharaoh was on the throne. Then when a new pharaoh came up on the throne that was some short guy, they go remeasure the cubit, and all of a sudden the cubit's 15 inches. Then you get an NBA player up on the throne, and all of a sudden the cubit is, going to be 21 inches. So the measure of a cubit would keep on changing every time whoever was on the throne changed significantly in their height, because the measure of a cubit was based upon the measure of a man. So when they're actually measuring this, we have to keep in mind that we don't know how tall people were in the pre-flood days. Our estimates could be off by even more, but we'll use 18 inches for purposes of our discussion. So say if they're going to use Noah's arm as the measure of the cubit, the advantage to that is, well, good, Noah's in charge of the project. So just go, take your string, measure, Dad, stick out your arm. You can measure the cubit. Well, what if Noah's an NBA player, and he's 7 feet tall? How long is the cubit going to be? What if Noah's a jockey? How long is the cubit going to be? And the answer is, in both cases, we don't know. But 15 to 18 inches is the traditional measure. For purposes of working this out, we're going to assume 18 inches. So, the size of the ark. Well, it's 300 cubits long. So we got 450 feet long. That is a big boat, especially when you consider they're building this out of wood. It's 50 cubits across, 75 feet across, 450 feet long, 75 feet across. It's 30 cubits tall, 45 feet tall. Okay, 450 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet. By today's ship standards, that's no big deal. But even with today's technology, trying to build a ship this size out of wood would be an experience. Because when we're building ships anywhere near this size, we use steel. And we use steel precisely because we have massive problems trying to build wooden ships as you approach and exceed the 300-foot mark. And we'll get into that. So 450 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet. The maximum interior space is about 450 by 75 by 45, because we don't know if the 450 is stem to stern or if it's the interior measure. So we have maximum interior space, 450 times 75 times 45, for a total of 1,518,750 cubic feet. That is about the cubic volume of a railroad stock car train, 570 cars long. 570 railroad stock cars, like we transport sheep in, like we transport cattle in. Now try to think how huge that is. Now for those people who haven't hung out at train tracks or been stuck in traffic watching this endless train go by, has anyone ever seen those giant metal storage containers? The kind of storage containers they load onto and take off of cargo ships. Okay, pretty close to the same size. 570 of those. Now, if you just had 570 of those, how many animals do you think you could stick in them? Lots and lots and lots. What if in addition just to having that many of those, you don't even have it divided up into walls, you just have that much space? Now you can do even more. What if there's no rule that says you can't put like levels inside it? That you've got stories of it, but you can have stacked levels. So if you're doing like bunny rabbits, you have to just put all the rabbits on the floor and have all this open space? Or can you have like little cages of rabbits stacked on top of cages of gerbils, on top of cages of guinea pigs, on top of cages of rats and mice and hamsters and lizards? But there's nothing that stops you from stacking them up. Now how many can you fit? It gets pretty impressive, doesn't it, when you realize how much space that is. Now, in the ark, you have 3 to 5 floors. Okay, how do we get 3 to 5 floors? Because the Bible says a lower, a second, and third. How many floors is that? A lower, second, and third, with stories inferred. That would be 3, right? So how do we get 5 if the Bible says 3? Well, the Bible doesn't tell you necessarily 3 stories. If it was 3 extra floors constructed on the inside, then that might have been 4 interior levels and 1 quote-unquote top level, which may have had an extra roof coming as the finished above, not to mention then on top of the roof itself. So if you have this giant box that you would call the ark, and God says, okay, now I want you to put 3 stories, 3 extra floors in there. So you go, okay, put 1 floor down above the bottom. Now instead of having just 1 box with just 1 ground floor, now 1 story, 1 extra floor, now you have 2 floors, 2 extra floors, you now have 3 floors, 4 extra floors, now you have 4 floors. And you still have the roof. And then he tells you to finish it above. Well, to finish it above means that put some kind of a roofing over it, like some type of patio awning type setup. You can use that roof area. So you could have up to 5 floors. And by the way, has anyone ever seen the old travel movies with the family station wagon and all the stuff piled up on top of the roof of the station wagon? Is there anything stopping Noah from using the roof and strapping a bunch of stuff down on his roof as tall as he needs it to be, and then just throw a tarp over it because he knows it's going to rain? He could do that too. So how much storage space does he have? The animals, generally, he probably needs to keep inside. He's got 1.5 million cubic feet to do that. But he has, an unknown number of available cubic feet that he also straps stuff up on the roof. So he's got a lot of available space. Just to round it off, he might have 2 million cubic feet of available space. Is that getting impressive yet? That is a big boat. Now, you have the structural integrity of the ark problem. Even using more modern technology, our wooden boats leak and need bilge pumps. Anyone know what a bilge pump is? What's a bilge pump?
It's like a boat. It's like a little pump with water leaks into it. Just pumps it right
Yep. It's a pump so that when water leaks into the boat, it pumps the water back out of the boat. So when we're doing big wooden boats, they leak. And sometimes they leak at a pretty darn good clip, and so we need to have bilge pumps. You can't just get your bucket and go down and every once in a while scoop out some water and toss it overboard. That when we hit the very large wooden ships, we needed significant bilge pumps. We need to constantly be pumping that water out. The longer the ship, the more they leak. Now, we, in the modern era, in the last couple of 100 years, have made very few attempts at wooden ships larger than 300 feet because of these problems. Yet Noah's Ark was 450 feet long, built thousands of years ago. Things that make you go, Well, here's some things to remember about the Ark. Number 1, the ship only had to last how long? 1 year. So it doesn't need massive structural integrity to float on the water forever and ever and ever. It just needs to last 1 year. Number 2, it had no masts and no sails. With no masts and no sails, it doesn't put extra stress on the vessel. Because one of the things that causes the distortion of the wood when it's built on the way we build ships now, is you have these massive masts and you have the wind hitting the mast, so wind hitting the sails. The sails don't pull on the boat directly. The sails pull on the masts. And so you have this basically towering telephone poles up over the ship that are being dragged along by the wind. Well, then that's flexing and torquing the wood that it's anchored to underneath. And so that puts stress, and that flexes and distorts the wood. And so then that becomes a stress issue that adds to the leaking. Also, of course, Noah's Ark had no engines for vibration. That's another problem that we run into a lot, is because we have the vibration of our mechanical engines. The vibration of our mechanical engines would also vibrate the wood in a wooden craft. And so when you're building like wooden steamships, for instance, the vibration of the engines keeps vibrating the wood and then makes the leaking problem worse. Something else to remember is it did not need to be able to move in a direction. It just had to float. And so when we're building our ships now, we don't build our ships to float, we build our ships to travel. So we are going from point A to point B. And so we craft our hulls so it can move in one direction. Noah's Ark didn't have to sail to any particular place. It just had to float. Now, there's an interesting little caveat in there. If one edge of Noah's Ark had this flaring up back end with this giant, wide, almost fin to catch the air, that whichever way the wind was blowing, it would turn the ark into the wind. So that way it would always be facing lengthwise into the wind, if there was a front and a back. That way, if the wind was blowing waves at it, it would always be facing lengthwise into the waves. Because where you have the roll problem, and the pitch and the roll problem is if a wave hits it sideways, then it tips to the side. Well, if you've ever been in something that tips to the side, kind of need your sea legs for stuff like that. Pitch is enough of a problem. When you're 450 feet long, the pitch, how far the front and the back go up and down, is the pitch. At 450 feet, your pitch can't be that big, otherwise you're plunging one end or the other all the way into the water. 75 feet wide, you can have a roll problem, though. But if you have this giant, what amounts to a wooden fin on one end of the boat, whenever the wind blows, it'll slowly turn the ark to face into the wind lengthwise, so that all you're dealing with then is pitch. You're not dealing with roll. Now, that's a pretty intriguing little engineering trick, huh? But all of these factors, the ship only had to last 1 year, had no master sails, no engines, only had to float. It didn't have to travel. These things make an ark easier to build. Now, here's some more interesting details. The proportions of the ark, its length ratio to its width ratio to its height ratio, are very similar to the proportions that we use for cargo ships today. Basically, we, all on our own, as far as I know, no shipwrights looked it up in the Bible and figured, hey, why don't we try these dimensions? But we figured out how to build cargo ships so that our cargo doesn't keep tipping and toppling and falling over in the storm. That those proportions provide a stable, smooth ride so as not to displace cargo, so it can handle storms better. These dimensions allow for an optimum level of roll without capsizing. So talking about that roll issue, if you have roll, these dimensions, the dimensions of the ark are such that you can tip the boat, not quite exactly flat, because by that time everything falls to one side, but you can tip it out at a perfect diagonal, at a 45-degree angle, and let it go, and it'll go back to flat. It's pretty amazing. Huh? So it allows for the most roll. That's why we build our cargo ships like this. So if our cargo ships get caught in rough seas, and we get caught by surprise sideways, that our cargo ships can roll 30, 45 feet to one side and right themselves without completely capsizing. Now, I can imagine at some point some shipwright who maybe was studying for the ministry at one time is going, now, wait a second. When he's reading the dimensions of Noah's Ark, going, well, this sounds familiar. I mean, we don't do 300 cubits by 50 cubits, but we do 150 feet by 25 feet. That's pretty curious. The dimensions listed in the Bible are ideal for carrying a huge load through a storm. Now, here's one of the interesting things to consider. Genesis is considered one of the books of Moses. So if Moses was just making this stuff up, how would he know? Where did Moses grow up? In Egypt, in the desert. Spent 40 years running around the desert. Spent 40 years after that running around the desert. Grew up in Egypt. Did they have any boats nearly this size? No. Did they do massive cargo vessels at that time? No. So it's interesting that all of this data is there. Continuing. No matter how many floors there were, a great deal of what was needed could be stacked or hung. We already talked about the idea you could stack the rabbits and put gerbils on top and put rats on top. And so you could stack your rodents, all your small animals you could stack. You could, of course, stack your grain. I mean, we do that today. We stack our grain. And you could also hang things. So you could, if you have ever seen the interior of an old ship where they used hammocks, I mean, what are you doing? Basically, you're hanging stuff from your rafters, and that's where your men sleep. But obviously, you could do that just as easily with equipment. You could do that with food. You could do that with, your luggage. Just hang it. Now, this affects the number of cubic feet that you can, or cubic volume that you can use. In fact, by stacking and by hanging and by doing all of that, you could use almost all of your cubic volume for something useful, keeping just enough space for you to do all the moving around that you need to do. The packed food could also serve to stabilize and cushion many of the animals for the roughest part of the ride. This would presumably be when the waves first hit. So say, you got your elephants and you got your giraffes. You don't want them to fall over. So, well, that's fun. We need to take all of this extra alfalfa and hay with us. So what we're going to do is we're going to hang all of them to the left and the right of the elephant, so that if the elephant is rocking back and forth, that's okay. He's got pillows on the left of him, pillows on the right of him. We don't want to put anything behind him. And then that will help keep the elephant stable. So that way when the pitch and the roll first starts, the elephant's stable. And then over time, they're eating all of that stuff, and so you get more and more space as you go. And so the food stuff being carried could serve a dual purpose. And the dual purpose could be to start off packing everything extra tight so that you can deal with the pitch and the roll of the initial floods eating, and then gradually give yourself more and more space as you start using up all of the food stuff and you're throwing the waste overboard. Is that interesting? I thought that was fascinating. Okay, now for the structure of the ark itself, you have the egg solution. Anyone ever tried this exercise with an egg? That you put the ends of an egg between the palms of your hand and you press them together. And even though an egg is very fragile, now provided you have an egg that doesn't have any cracks in it, I thought about actually doing this, but if there's any structural flaws in the egg, I'm going to smash it in my hands. But if it's a good solid egg, you can put it between the palms of your hand, you can press together. As long as you press straight in from the outside, the egg won't break. Because the parabolic form of both ends of the eggshell is such that it can withstand a tremendous amount of pressure end to end like that. Now, if you do a hard surface, well, then it's going to pop into the side. You can do this because of the shape, the parabolic shape of the ends of the eggs. Now, if you put the egg flat ways and do it, it's just going to smash because that part doesn't have that integrity. Now, the technical term, shifting gears just slightly, of the shape of a hanging cable is called a catenary curve. And another closely related curve is called a hyperbola. And those are also close to parabolas. Now the point is that these shapes are powerfully resistant to outside pressure in the direction of the apex of the curve. So for the egg, you've got two parabolic apexes on both ends. When you get to a catenary curve of the shape that a hanging cable makes, if you build a structure out of that, it can take a tremendous amount of pressure from down below. In fact, if you look at most bridges, not suspension bridges, but if you've seen the big, long, flat bridges that have just one big arch coming from one end to the other, that those arches are made in a parabolic arc. Sometimes they might be in a precise catenary curve. The catenary curve is actually the most highly structurally, in the shape that has the highest structural integrity to withstand pressure. As part of what it does on a bridge, if you put tons and tons and tons of weight in the middle of that bridge, the nature of that curve, the physics of that curve, allow all that downward pressure gets displaced sideways into the mountains that curve arch is anchored into. And so basically what you end up doing there is as you come across that bridge and the weight is pushing down on the ends of the bridge, well, that's pushing down on your mountain edges or your valley edges. As you get to the middle where it would normally flex down the most and be in the most danger, well, then that gets displaced back into the mountains too. And that allows a tremendous amount of structural integrity for the bridge using mathematical physics. So if Noah set up a frame at the dimensions God commanded, 450 feet long, and he hung rope or cables to achieve the height, width, and length he was instructed, he could have made his entire ark using catenary curves, using arcs. Pun totally intended. He could have built a craft that would have been able to withstand a great deal of external pressure, and in fact, the external pressure might even have pressed the boards together tighter. Like when you press the sides of the eggs. Now, by using this catenary curve in all directions, he could create a shift so that as water pressure is pressing in all directions, all it's going to do is press the arc in tighter, combined with all the pitch, and the pitch would allow sufficient flex in the wood without leaking in the wood, but with the catenary curves, it makes the arc more solid. Now, it's harder to do that if your ship needs to travel in one direction, because now most of the pressure is always coming from one direction. But if you're creating it so it's floating, you can do this because it allows the pressure in every single direction simultaneously. Is that a fascinating little mathematical tidbit there? I thought that was fascinating. So combining the dimensions with the shape changes the way the craft interacts with the wave. Combining the dimensions with the shape, it changes the way the craft interacts with the waves. Now, this part was fascinating. Because now I was only told about this verbally. I couldn't actually find this experiment. But that a craft that's built on a parabolic arc system maintains a stable relative gravity even when outside forces rock the craft. That when you have this massive parabolic arc from stem to stern, from starboard to port, is that when it rocks, your internal gravity stays straight down. Because the forces, as it tips the boat to the side, the way it rocks, the roll to the wave, matches up with the direction of internal gravity. And so basically what you have is an effective inertial stabilizer. Which is phenomenal. Now, I'm not going to belabor this point too much because I couldn't find the experiment online, but I was told about this and I thought, well, that was fascinating. It'd be interesting to find out more details about that and the level of precision they used to measure that and where that data is. But just so that you know, that was one of the interesting snippets I was told. And it was by someone who didn't believe that the Bible is the inerrant work of God. That actually came from more of the New Agey side. It was a piece of trivia from the side that believes that the Bible has a whole bunch of hidden messages from alien species, and those were the people that did the experiment, which might have something to do with why it's so hard for me to find. So I don't know. Now, how many animals were in this boat? There's one giant ship. Well, first the Bible talks about kinds, and we're not exactly sure what a kind is. Ultimately, we just know that the ark's animals would have to be the forebearers of every living animal alive today. Sort of, but not really, actually. Because, second, there are a lot of animals that would not need to be on the ark. The tens of thousands of species that live in seawater. Okay, do sea animals need to be on the ark? No. How about the animals that live in brackish water? That's a salty-ish water where fresh and salt water combine. No, they don't need to be inside the dry boat. Or fresh water? Obviously not. All those could live in a flooded world. Some other species may be able to survive without the ark as well. Particularly some cave-dwelling creatures might survive in underground pockets that would survive the flood. So there's a lot of animals that don't need to be in the boat. Now the ark also, obviously, would not need to carry animals that were already extinct. The question is, so how many animals were already extinct? Well, this goes back to the idea that entropy started at the fall. If Adam and Eve's fall didn't just introduce sin into the world, but introduced entropy into the world. If entropy started at the fall, then things would have started to break down at the fall. In short, as entropy marched, certain types of materials that had a very low tolerance for entropy would start to break down. Creatures at a similar level of low tolerance for entropy would die at the same time. Whatever elements had that level of intolerance for entropy would die at the same time the element died, which would result in wave after wave of mass extinction combined with material breakdown that could result in the stratification and fossilization that we find today. Now, this could also have been part of Adam's punishment, that he would see the first waves of extinction. That whatever has the lowest level of tolerance for entropy would die first. Say, one of the earliest things he might have watched die are all the trilobites, along with whatever element was similar in its intolerance for entropy. And then there'd be massive stratification of trilobites in a stratified level of fossilization. Then the next element would be breaking down along with the next wave of things, and say a whole bunch of delicate amphibians would go. In fact, do we find in this day and age that amphibians are one of our earliest warning systems that we have a severe problem in an environment? Yeah! Amphibians are very, very sensitive to changes in the environment. Imagine going from the non-existence of entropy to the existence of entropy. Probably could have a whole bunch of amphibians very sensitive to the onset of entropy. How about some small reptiles? Medium-sized reptiles, giant reptiles. Whole bunch of stuff, mass extinction and wave after wave after wave, collapsing down about the same time that certain elements would collapse down, becoming fossilized, because when things die and get buried in wetness and such. Oh, by the way, could they get buried in wetness before the flood? Yeah, no rain. There's all this mists coming up. So if you need any more water, that's okay. It's coming up every single day. Maybe even every single hour on the hour. Who knows what the schedule was. So you got the water. You have an elemental breakdown. You have mass extinctions of things dying. When you combine those things, you get fossilization. So whatever layers of the stratified fossil record exist that happened prior to the flood, you get this whole massive event going on where you're knocking off a whole bunch of species, a whole bunch of whole types of animals that will no longer need to be on the boat, so that Noah doesn't have to sit around and figure, okay, where's my T-Rex section going to be? Okay, I tell you what, we'll put our Velociraptors over here, our Utah Raptors over there, T-Rex over there, Allosaurus over there, Carnosaurus over there, and that he wouldn't have to carry those because they wouldn't have to be on the boat because they're already extinct. And so those are some of the extra considerations on the extinction. And of course, that could be a whole thing, a lesson to itself, obviously. But even so, with all of those things you eliminate, that still leaves thousands of kinds. There's about 2,000 families of animals. So at the family level, you have 2,000. At the genus level, you have 16,000. At the species level, you have 35 to 40,000 species. Now, only a few animals are large. I mean, we're always impressed with, the zebras and the elephants and the giraffes and the lions and tigers and bears, oh my. But most animals aren't that big. Most animals are small. A rabbit or sheep is a good estimate of the average size animal. So depending upon how you line up your whole set of animals, if you include all the teeny tiny guys, a rabbit's about in the middle. If you mostly include all the land animals and you don't, take all the insects over on one side, a sheep is about the middle animal. So you could think of how we're going to use this. We'll use the higher number, 40,000. That's the highest number we have at the species level. Probably not that many kinds, but the species level, we got 40,000. We'll use the larger median, the sheep. So we won't even go, okay, we're going to go with Kind's 2,000 rabbits. Okay, well, that's easy enough. You don't need 570 stockyard cars to do 2,000 rabbits. We'll go 40,000 and we'll go sheep. The ark could hold 40,000 sheep-sized animals using less than 1/3 of the available cubic feet of the interior of the ark. It takes about 500,000 cubic feet to hold 40,000 sheep. 40,000 sheep. So we're going the larger of the medians, the highest of the numbers. We still have 1,000,000 cubic feet of usable space on the interior of the ark, and that's without loading the top of it up like an old station wagon. So they could, all the animals could fit. Now we do have some other problems though. Animal waste. It's like, okay, you got 40,000 sheep. You've got a problem going on the inside of this ark, don't you? Because you're feeding these sheep, so you're putting some stuff in the front end, and you put stuff in the front end, and you're going to get some stuff coming out the back end. So this is perhaps one of the most daunting issues aboard the ark. Some system of capturing and getting rid of liquid waste is relatively easy using a gutter system. But solid waste, that's a bit more problematic. Now, a couple of things. If the larger animals are on the upper decks, it reduces how much it needs to be lifted. Now, you don't even have to put the larger animals on the upper decks. If you stratify them based upon the volume of waste versus the cubic feet of storage space for the animals. So say if you have all of the food stuff stored down below and you keep the animals as high up in the decks as you can, then you only have to lift the solid waste up high enough to get it up over the water line so you can dump it. If you have all the animals on the very, very bottom, well, now you have to lift all of that waste down from the bottom. So you have 40,000 sheep, 20 feet below the water line. And you're trying to lift all the waste of 20,000 sheep up 20 feet to get to the water line, say, maybe as much as another 20 or 30 feet to dump it over the side. That's going to take some work. And how many people do you have? 8! Can you imagine 8 people shoveling stuff in these wheelbarrows, wheeling it up 5 flights to dump it over the side? Are you going to have time to do anything else? Are you even going to have time to do that? Or you're just going to have to leave this stuff? Okay, so you need a system. Now, there's a number of solutions to this, and you could look up online and you could find a whole bunch of different solutions. One of the ones I thought was the most intriguingly probable is you have some system of capturing the waste, and then you use body weight when descending as your counterweight to lift the waste. Now, here's part of how this works. You've got the solid waste being generated. You don't want to have to keep carrying it up. But you just have a system where basically you just shove it all off to one side. Now, if you try to think of it like, I just lost the name of it, but like a pulley system that has those little buckets on one side that goes up one side and then dumps and comes down the other side. Like, okay, yeah, that sounds good enough, but then someone has to sit there and keep pulling on the thing anyway, right? So you save the whole wheelbarrow up 5 flights, but now you have to lift all this other stuff up 5 flights. Well, a relatively easy solution is you have what essentially amounts to a down elevator. And at any time you need to come down from an upper level, you step onto this little platform or grab hold of your little loop or whatever, and you go down, and your body weight then becomes the counterweight to roll the thing up however many stories you're going down. That makes sense? So you're with me so far. Now, does that make it a whole lot easier? Could you even practically automate that system with a system of pulleys and gears? Yeah, it's actually, suddenly it's not too complicated. Now, what if you're getting backlogged on your waste? Well, then you head upstairs with your horse, and you just keep walking your horse up the stairs and back down, up the stairs and back down, and up the stairs and back down, until you get all caught up on your waste. And then you don't have 8 human beings with wheelbarrows trying to wheel up 5 stories to dump it over the side. You take one of your bigger, heavier animals, or a couple of your bigger, heavier trained animals. Maybe you don't even have to walk the animal upstairs. You just send the animal upstairs. And your brother's upstairs, and your brother leads the animal out onto your little elevator-style platform, and the weight of the animal wheels all the way down and all the way up. That'd be a relatively easy way to do it that doesn't require very complex technology. It would require some know-how, though, and some foresight. Almost like someone would have had to give Noah some blueprints or something. But we have some evidence just based on the dimensions of the ark that is likely the case. Now, there's a problem with acquiring and storing enough food for about a year for not just Noah and his family, of course, but all of the animals, including the carnivores. Fresh water is an issue. Animal waste is an issue. How many animals you can care for, not just carry, but care for is an issue. In fact, this has led some people to study it to hypothesize that, well, maybe all the animals were miraculously put into hibernation. Is that possible? Yeah, it's possible. Bible doesn't indicate that it's so, and usually if God's going to do some sort of miraculous sign at that level, he would generally indicate that he did something, but it is still possible. It doesn't say he didn't, so he could have. So on the food and water issue, Genesis 6:21, and take thou unto thee of all food that is eaten. Okay, so just in case you weren't sure what he meant by food, he means food that is eaten. And thou shalt gather it to thee, and it shall be for food for thee and for them. Who's them? Them is the animals. So imagine being told, like, okay, you're going to have 40,000 sheep. Go pick up some food, load it up. Carnivores. Carnivores are always a problem. Carnivores may not always need to eat meat. In fact, I was at the zoo yesterday, and in the, forget which carnivore cage it was. Which enclosure was it that had the cucumbers in there? The bears. Oh, yeah, the bears. The bears are omnivores, and they were feeding them cucumbers. There's been stories where they ran out of meat, and they fed the lions grain and alfalfa. And the lions survived just fine. For a while, anyway. I don't imagine they did that indefinitely. But, that's been in the news from our modern zoos. And so carnivores are able to subsist, at least at some level, for some period of time without eating meat. And so prior to the flood, it's possible that even the carnivores were not meat eaters, that they became meat eaters. We don't know for sure. It doesn't say clearly. There's implications, though. Now, clean animals were taken by sevens. We always think it was 2 by 2, but it wasn't 2 by 2. There's clean and unclean animals. Unclean animals came in 2 by 2. The clean animals came in 7 by 7. Odd numbers of them. So there were animals aboard that could be food for the carnivores if the carnivores required meat. In fact, if you just wanted to keep even numbers of males and females, you could serve up one of each clean animal and still have an equal number of males and females for breeding after the flood. Hay and grain would be taken in abundance, more than enough for a year. Now, on one hand, there is plenty of space to store enough fresh water for the needs of the ark for a year. The Genesis 6:21 command may be assumed to include water. That it could have included fresh water. But on the other hand, we often just presume that all the flood waters were salt water because that's what we think of. Massive flood, we think of being out of the open sea, we think salt water. But if the whole world was flooded with salt water, all the freshwater fish would die, wouldn't they? If you put freshwater fish in salt water, they die. If you put saltwater fish in freshwater, they die. The brackish fish, from what I understand, can survive a little while, a little bit too fresh, a little bit too salty, but you dump a brackish water fish into the open sea, it'll die. So you need freshwater, brackish water, and saltwater preserved. So it's likely, therefore, that areas of salt water, brackish water, and fresh water had to be around, and the ark may have spent a considerable portion of its time in freshwater seas. Because if you think about it, the water bursting from, quote-unquote, the fountains of the deep, fresh water or salt water? Probably fresh water. The rain, fresh water or salt water? Well, that's also fresh water. Now, the waves, okay, now that's probably salt water. So God would have to have flooded the world, now this gets back to a flood question, in such a way as to preserve massive sections of fresh water in order to preserve all of his freshwater fish. Is that interesting? So say if the ark is literally in the middle of nowhere where everyone's trying to figure out what the heck is this guy building and why is he building it here? The thing looks like it's meant to float in the water. So there's no water around here. But where it was built was where fresh water was going to accumulate. It was going to burst forth from around, flood in, and there's going to be this massive thousands and thousands of cubic miles of fresh water. And the edges of the fresh water would be brackish water, and then the rest of the world would be salt water. And that's assuming there's just one big section of fresh water. Then all of the freshwater fish can survive in the freshwater section. All the brackish water fish can survive in the borderlands between the fresh and the saltwater. And all the saltwater creatures have the whole rest of the sea to survive in. Does that make sense? And that the reason the flood occurred largely from the fountains of the deep bursting open is God was building this massive multi-hundred, multi-thousand square mile zone of fresh water. And continuing to pour down 40 days and 40 nights of more fresh water, possibly largely into the freshwater zone to protect and preserve the freshwater zone, and for 40 days and 40 nights providing a constant source of clean fresh water coming in from above, making it very easy to gather. And then even after that's done for the next most of a year while the floodwaters are slowly receding, that if they need more fresh water, all they have to do is go to the edge of the boat, drop a bucket, boom, fresh water. That would be pretty cool, huh? Ventilation is an issue. Has anyone ever been in a hot room just with a handful of human bodies? Around here, when we have sparring days, and you've got 15 or 20 people sparring in a room that has an open door on one end, 2 open doors on the other, and the fan running, it still gets pretty ripe in the room. You stick 40,000 sheep inside something. How long is it going to be between the sheep just breathing, and otherwise eliminating their waste before everything's just going to asphyxiate in here? I mean, sometimes you feel like you're going to asphyxiate at the end of a 1-hour sparring class. That's going to be a problem. But there's a lot of low-tech options for ventilation. By using open slatted floors, air can travel between the floors. The heat generated by the animals will cause the air to rise. How many people know hot air rises? Okay, so the hot air wants to go up and escape. So now the problem you have is, so how do you get the cool air that wants to drop down to come in on the bottom? Well, one of the easier ways to do that is a ventilation shaft that can draw cool air below decks. Now, we do something similar to this today. If you ever see in your movies with the big ships, the giant ventilation that comes over and then it curves over so it faces downward so that rain doesn't get on the inside. That you have just one of those loops looping over, going all the way down to the bottom deck and just opening into the bottom deck. All the heat generated by your 40,000 sheep-sized animals causes all the interior air to want to rise up and just to escape out the ventilation at the top. Meanwhile, you have these shafts on both ends and scattered here and there throughout the ship, so that as the hot air rises, it creates this slight vacuum on the bottom, and the cool air comes in from the top, runs all the way down to the bottom, and it keeps putting fresh, cool air in the bottom, while the heat generated by all of the animals keeps rising the air up to the top. And so you have constantly moving air, constantly refreshing air, on a very, very low-tech option. That gets to be kind of fascinating, then, doesn't it? And there's a whole bunch of other options. That's just one of the many low-tech options that doesn't require complex machinery, doesn't require a whole heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system. That all it requires is some vents and just a little bit of know-how. Less know-how than the pulley system to get all of the animal waste up from lower decks to dump it over the side. And so that becomes pretty easy to do. So for virtually any problem in the ark, there are a number of possible solutions. Now, we do not know which answer was the answer. We do not know if any of the answers that we guess at are the answer. But we can falsify theories. If someone comes up with an idea, we can prove that it's false. If it works, we have no way to know if that is the answer. But if we put forth some idea, some theory, and then we can figure out, nope, no way that could work. Like one person had solved the size of the animal problem, assuming a lot of animals of larger size, and says, well, but if young animals were taken, then they would all fit. Like, okay, well, that sounds good on its face, right? You're taking basically a whole bunch of baby animals. Okay, well, baby animals significantly cuts down on the amount of cubic feet that you need, right? But here's the problem. The person who put forth this theory ran into one tiny little problem, is how long does it take most animals to reach adulthood? Do most animals reach adulthood in a year? Adult size in a year or less? And so his whole baby animal theory was pretty quickly falsified because, okay, that doesn't solve your problem because by the end of the year, all these animals are pretty much full-sized animals. They might not be giant versions of the animals, the biggest ones, but they're at least going to be adultish size, and that doesn't solve your problem for you. So then what do? You dump the theory. Once you know something cannot be true, you do not keep postulating it as a theory. So once something is falsified, it ought to be abandoned, even if you have no better theory to solve the problem. Now this is critically important because one of the reasons I know so much about creation and evolution science on both sides is because I spend a considerable amount of my time reading the evolutionary scientist material that constantly debunked the creation scientist material. So I spend my time over there reading all of their things. Reading my favorite essay is 6 Questions Creationists Can't Answer. And then go answer the 6 questions, because it's actually not all that complicated once you think about it. In fact, Stuart came to me one day and wanted to know, okay, how do I learn more about this? And I said, well, a lot of it is you just have to know how to think. So I gave him that essay, and I told him there are answers. I don't think you got all 6 of them. I think you figured out 4 out of 6 of them just on logic. Not even having to do research and science and thinking outside the box, just on logic to figure out he got 4 out of 6 of them answered. But for years, evolutionary debaters would use those 6 questions to box the creationists in corners. And the reason it works so effectively is those 6 questions creationists can't answer cannot be answered with what were the pat answers being put forth by the creation scientists at the time. That it falsified the creation science assertions, and because the creation scientists held on to those ideas because they didn't have a better theory yet, that they got blown out of the water in these debates. For a long time, the whole creation versus evolution debate was handled in debate format. And the creationists won debate after debate after debate. I mean, they weren't losing any debates anywhere at all because they were gathering their data in order to debate. Meanwhile, what were the evolutionary scientists doing? They were gathering their data in order to be scientists, to deal with the scientific community on scientific terms, not to engage in public debate. So their information wasn't organized effectively to do that, because that's not the way science works. Well, once the evolutionists got used to the idea of, okay, this is what these people are doing, they started figuring, okay, so how do we actually counter that? Because science doesn't spend a lot of time countering theories like that, and it doesn't spend a lot of time answering the kind of questions that were being asked, the public debate style questions. Once they started to nail it, then the tide turned. And in, a recent theist versus atheist debate I saw, I honestly think that the atheists did a better job. First off, they obeyed the ground rules. The Christian theists disobeyed the ground rules. And they tried to prove their point by breaking one of the rules that had been previously agreed to as one of the terms of the debate, is that there would be no using the Bible as proof. And they tried to use the Bible as proof. And so when the other side was countering, they basically said, okay, well, first off, we have an integrity issue. One of the ground rules that they agreed to beforehand, that they even set forth, is we will not just use the Bible as evidence. And now what are they doing? They made one of their entire arguments based on nothing but the Bible. That they are presuming we accept the 10 Commandments as the inspired law of God. And they had a very legitimate argument, saying, now, if they would violate even the rules of the debate, how much can we trust what they've told us? It says, well, let's address their evidence. And they continue to dismantle 2 out of 3 of their points. And as a Christian theist, I'm watching the debate and I'm thinking, you just handed the debate to them. I'm listening to the Christian side put forth and I'm like, oh boy. If I was the atheist evolutionist on the other side, I could rip you to shreds. The atheist evolutionists didn't do quite as good a job as I thought I could have done. I think that would be fun, though, to be the atheist in the debate, to be the evolutionist. I've done that, by the way. We call them friendly fire debates, where I've taken on a room of Christian theists as the atheists, and I argued them to a standstill. Just using logic. I mean, not yelling, screaming, calling names. I've done the same thing as an evolutionist, where I debated a room of young earth creationists to a standstill. And they had to concede I won the debate. Now, I am a young earth creationist, and I am a Christian theist. But you got to know both sides. That's the lawyer technique. You got to know both sides. If you don't know both sides, how do you even know you're right? Much less how are you going to deal with really, really good points the other side comes up with. So once something's falsified, we abandon it. You do not keep using falsified theories. As an aside, never, ever, ever make an argument based on the lack of evidence. Bad move. At one point, the Christian creationists argued that, well, if their evolutionary theory were true, we would find all these invertebrate fossils, and there are no invertebrate fossils. And then we found a whole bunch of invertebrate fossils. To which the evolutionists went, ha 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 ha. Well, do you think the Christian creationists suddenly went, oh, hey, there's invertebrate fossils. Well, then you must be right. No, they just changed their argument. But that's one of the dangers when you make an argument from a lack of evidence. One of the arguments against the Bible. The Bible keeps talking about this big Hittite empire. There's no evidence of any Hittites anywhere. And then we find all this archaeological evidence of this massive Hittite empire that we never knew really existed, which makes me go, oh. At which point all the Christians who are believing they're Hittites in the Bible go, ha 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 ha. Or like, well, there was no writing in the days of Moses, and then guess what happens? We find writing from prior to the days of Moses. So, lack of evidence is a bad, bad way to make any kind of an argument. Now we have the Pangaea factor. Pangaea is a singular supercontinent hypothesized as existing in the distant past. If it broke up during or because of the flood, and the continents were still drifting at that time, the animals could have spread if they were quick. They had to be quick. Now what's interesting is what are some of the animals that are capable of traveling the furthest in the fewest number of years? Yeah, you have flying animals and stuff like that because they're not limited by a lot of terrain. But the ground animals, it's marsupials. Because when most animals are coming around the birthing season, and now they have their young, they got to slow down for a while, don't they? Marsupials carry their young. So you can have these tiny little young marsupials. Well, that's okay. They're in the pouch. Now, if you put Pangaea back together, and you put Mount Ararat as the epicenter, anyone know where most of our marsupials are? If you put Pangaea back together, your marsupials, most of which the ones people know of are the kangaroos family and the koalas and stuff, they end up on the outer edge. They got there first. Our North American marsupials, well, was North America connected to Asia? Was North America connected to Europe and Africa? South America in there. The other marsupials we have are over on our side of the edge. So that's a little interesting tidbit. But the Pangaea factor significantly solves the dispersion of the animals problem, but it does create some other problems, because then you have to solve the continental drift problem, because the continents would have been moving quickly and then have to slow down to a crawl. You have to solve the speciation problem, such as getting into many types of dogs in so short a time. So on the whole dog question, some of the solutions include contested areas of science. Here's an example of how science changes. The speed of light question, once thought infinite. That up until the 1800s, the speed of light was considered to be infinite, and obviously so. No one argued that. But it's now known to have a speed. But it wasn't until the late 1800s that science began to go, hey, it seems light has a speed. Light is not infinite. Well, nowadays, some people think that light might even be slowing down. So you have some of the questions. What would a lower entropy environment actually look like? The speed of light is actually related to the flow of entropy. Now, we do expect the heat death of the universe is at the end of the line, but what might a low entropy environment look like? We can guess the heat death of the universe, where there is no longer any differentiation, there's no more energy to be spent, but what would it look like in a low entropy environment? What could a practically zero entropy environment look like? And the answer is, I don't think we know. I don't think anyone's really tried to guess at it. But I'm sure from time to time some people have tried to think about it. Kind of bends your brain a little bit. And then on the speciation question, say the dogs. Pretty much all dogs can interbreed. I wouldn't probably want to put a St. Bernard together with a Chihuahua just now. But genetically you could, even if for practical matters, I really can't see that working. But I mean, most dog lines can interbreed. So from the ark, all you would need really is one baseline dog. So you have one baseline dog on the ark, that one kind of dog could become all the breeds that presently exist. But you have the speciation problem. So how quickly did the speciation of all our different types of dogs begin? How long did it take? With the humans, one homogeneous human race would break into all of the races. How did that happen? How fast did that have to happen? There would need to be a lot of core information already contained in the kind, and then you would need to be able to spread quickly, and then, and this is where it gets to be problematic, settle in and get locked down. That, okay, now we have all these different types of humans. You might start with one baseline human that is, what you would expect now if you had a mix of all of the races. I mean, you get what we call the Milano children, the ones that are half black, half white, and you see, okay, how those races intermix. We have in Australia the creamy children that they called them, that they used to separate out. Where you can say, obviously, the Aborigines can also interbreed with the whites, and you have all of these things to say, okay, well, what if you just kind of keep that process going? In my case, when people ask me what my ethnic heritage is, my genetic heritage, I mean, I go back to Japan, Okinawa, China, Native American, Irish, Scottish, English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, and a few other countries with percentages too small for me to bother to remember. The last name Conway, that's an Irish name. You go back into my history enough. The Kellys married into the Conway family. The Kellys were also Irish. And so you follow my masculine genealogy by name back, and you get two different branches of Irish families. So I have genetically a lot of Sword in me, and the Sword family also comes from England. And then you go back the other way. I've got Arakawa, I've got Fujiwara, and Fujiwara just so happens to be the same family name as Musashi Miyamoto from the 1600s. Think he might have been one of my ancestors? No, because he didn't have any children. So we know that's not the case. And the Fujiwara family, it's practically the Smiths of Japan. So big family. I mean, they were a ruling family in Japan for 1,000 years. So how many Fujiwaras do you think you can have? A whole bunch. And so I've got all of this blend of races in me. And, this is what I look like. Well, I don't have all the races. What do you just keep on sort of adding them in for another, 8, 10 generations? What are my great-great-great-great-grandkids going to look like? Who knows? But that would probably be what the baseline humans look like. One of my favorite places that I saw was they did a H.G. Wells film. And when they went all the way to the future, the humans and the Morlocks period, they actually found a whole bunch of people that looked like a mix of all human races. And so if you ever get a chance to see that movie, I just lost the name of the movie. It was The Time Machine. That if you see the modern remake of The Time Machine, you can see that could be what the baseline humans look like. Noah and his family and their wives. And so you would need something like that, then it would speciate. So the racial diversity among humans would have come from Adam and Eve to Noah and his sons. The 4 men obviously would be homogeneous. Because, you have Noah and the 3 boys are his sons. So the 4 of them would obviously be homogeneous. But the 4 wives could have been somewhat differentiated in the generation since Adam and Eve. All we would know for sure is that they would have to be pure strain humans to have been preserved through the flood. That's the only thing we really can guess about them. Now the Tower of Babel, which is a different lesson, we're doing the Tower next week, probably divided language into homogeneous, physiologically homogeneous groups. That would indicate then the racial division of humanity probably occurred over about 2,000 years and about 15 generations, from Adam to the Tower. And then, and this is where it gets interesting, it settled in without much change for thousands of years after that. And so then you have some genetics questions to ask about things like that. How could you get such racial divisions, physiological divisions occurring, and then have them settle in. And so there are some questions that still need to be answered, and not much time has been spent trying to answer these questions to my knowledge. But here's a provocative hint contained in Scripture. During the Exodus, for the first time, God forbade intermarriage between close siblings. Leviticus 20 is when God declared a permanent change on allowable marriage and sexual relationships. Until then, it was okay. But by then, things were settling down and genetic error was going to become an issue. Because remember, Abraham and Sarah were half-siblings, and that was okay back then. All right, cousins marrying cousins, that whole thing was no big deal back then. But for some reason, God, he knows these things. In Leviticus 20, it says, okay, we can't do that anymore. Okay, my people Israel, you are not allowed to do that anymore. So whatever else is going on anywhere else in the world, God changed the rules for his people in Leviticus 20. So that's something that you can go use as a basis to say, okay, well, let's study this. Like, what could happen that by this period in time, so from here to here, the rules were this, and then by around this time, something would have changed enough that God would make a new rule. Now, would that be an interesting line of inquiry for science to look at? In fact, if you could figure out some of these answers, might that help us cure diseases, solve genetic problems, solve genetically inherited diseases, if we could figure out that answer? And so that's one of the values of science and the Word of God. If you assume that the Word of God is true, now the question is, do we truly understand it? But if we truly understood it, we would see that it was true. And we use that as a foundation for scientific inquiry to start to figure out the mechanics of things. Then we can use that figuring out of the mechanics of things, which is science, to figure out how we use those mechanics to actually get something done, which is technology. And a lot of the old-time scientists, before science became largely an atheistic, secularized profession, the old-time scientists always used to use a theistic assumption to start their inquiry. In fact, Einstein was reported as having said something to the effect of, he assumes that God created the universe and ponders how he would have done it. He assumed intelligent design. He assumed all the rules work the way they work because they are genius. And he tried to figure out, basically, if I had infinite genius, if I had infinite wisdom, if I knew exactly what I was doing and had all the power to do it, how would I do it? And because he thought that way, he was able to figure out a whole bunch of stuff that just basically turned science on its head. Otherwise, you have to begin with observation and form hypotheses from observation. Well, that can take a lot of observation. But if you begin with certain assumptions, such as design, and then you go investigate and say, logically that would make sense. Well, let's go see if that's the way it really is. And then you go check it out. And it's amazing how often you find out when science explores things that things make sense from a creationist perspective. Now, where one of the problems is what the theistic creationists so often would do? Is they just look at something and go, wow, that's complicated. Oh, praise to God, it's a miracle. Let's move on. And they stop science. So instead of creationism becoming an impetus for real core science, the theistic aspect of design then became an excuse to not do science. And then, of course, the secularists took over because what are they doing? They're doing science. But it's interesting, though, as they do more and more of that, they keep landing on pieces of information that the creation scientists go, aha, you see. Well, so the theistic scientists should have been the one to figure it out in the first place, because they're the ones that have the whole set of principles and philosophies and the overbearing way of thinking that should guide them to look for that sort of thing. But part of it is there's no money to fund theistic scientists right now. So even the scientists that are theistic, who will use an intelligent design presumption when they begin their research, will never admit to it, because they know that that's all taboo right now in the scientific community. Hopefully that'll change. Okay, young Earth creation. Now, just so everyone knows, Agathos loosely holds to a young Earth creationist point of view. That means that is our point of view. It is what we think happened. But yeah, if you agree with it, you agree with it. If you don't, you don't. But we don't think salvation hinges on being a young earth creationist. For us, old earth creation is almost as acceptable to us as young earth. But the point is creation. And notably, now this is an Agatha's difference. Some people look at theistic evolution as basically that evolution happened but was guided by God. We see theistic evolution as a viable option too. A lot of young earth creationists in particular say, well, theistic evolution is a cop-out. It's a cop-out position. But by introducing God into the theistic evolution creation, you can solve all the outstanding issues with evolution. And so it actually uses God to bridge the mathematical gaps in evolution. So what's wrong with that? We don't really see that there's a big problem with that. We think that young earth creationism holds the most merit. Old earth creation holds the second most merit. Theistic evolution is kind of a hybrid position, but there's not enough of a problem with theistic evolution to just say, that's wrong, you believe that, you're a heretic. Which is what, sometimes people get very dogmatic about this sort of thing. But theistic evolution has the merit of abiding by the principle of economy of miracles, which is God doing minimal intervention, creating processes by which things take place. Because all the mathematical improbabilities of evolution, what if God engineered all of those mathematical solutions into the very beginning of life? So that if you have all these mathematical evolutionary problems, but say, for the sake of argument, we tell people, all right, well, we'll go with your argument that evolution took place. We'll go with your argument that all this stuff really happened. We know mathematically we get all this bad stuff whenever you have mutant distortions of things, that things just die. How are you going to get from the reptile to the bird? How are you going to do all of that? There's so many wildly improbable things that would have to occur that basically the whole dog thing that we have going on, where one baseline dog turns into all of these different dogs, how much more complicated would it be for God to travel back thousands and thousands of years before that and say, okay, we're going to make this just a little bit more interesting. I'm going to make, how about we'll start with 2 fish, 1 amphibian, maybe a couple of reptiles and a mammal or 2, and 1 bird type. And we're going to make all the rest of the stuff out of that. How much information would have to be preloaded into the genetics of such creatures for such a thing to even be possible? Then you start getting like, whoa, that'd be a pretty serious genetic engineering. So theistic evolution, in my opinion, makes God look even more impressive. Happen to be a young earth creationist. Old earth creationist, I don't have an argument with you. Theistic evolution, we'll have a nice conversation because there's a lot of interesting things in there. That all 3 of those boil down to God did it and he's a genius. All right, so long as we conclude God did it and he's a genius, I'm okay with you. Because God is a genius. So that's stuff about the boat. Next time we're going to talk about the tower. Tower of Babel and what was going on there. Father God, we praise and we honor and we glorify you. Our King and our Lord, our Master and our Maker. We lift you up on high, Lord. We worship you. And on this day, we ask that we can praise you with how we treat our mothers today for this day, how we praise you this week, how we praise you with our life. We praise you with our thinking, Lord, as we consider the wonders of who you are, and rather than just blindly accept, that we try to figure things out. Rather than blindly reject, we really seriously consider things. And that this helps us think, Lord. And that this way of thinking, this way of considering, this way of trying to reconcile things rather than just going, okay. That it helps us stretch our mind and behold the wonder and the glory of our genius God, so that we can praise you more deeply and richly, and that we know that if you could do all of these things, if there are all of these answers, Lord, that we can trust your word. And the magnitude of the impact that can have in our day-to-day lives, knowing that as we understand your word, that we can truly trust your word and we can trust you, Lord. How that can transform our lives and how we live day to day. In Jesus' name.